Welcome everyone to the Federal Budget Breakfast. Good morning, my name is Matt Birrell and thank you for joining us for this second time in 2022 for the SW Federal Budget Breakfast. I acknowledge the traditional custodians throughout Australia and their connection to land, sea and community, and we pay our respect to their elders past, present and emerging. Well, we have a full lineup of experts to talk us through last night's budget, some of them well known to you from previous budget breakfasts, plus some new faces to today's run sheet. We'll first start with the thoughts of Catherine Birch of the ANZ. Catherine will provide us the ANZ's views on the macroeconomic themes from last night's budget. Next, we'll hear from Greg Will. Greg is a SW partner based out of our Sydney office, and Greg will take us through some of the results of the survey that each of you has had the chance to respond to and how the budget either hit or missed its mark according to that feedback. We'll then move to Bill Lang, Executive Director of Small Business Australia. Bill will provide his take on last night's budget as it affects small and medium enterprises. And after all that, we'll spend some time on a deeper dive into some of the specific announcements for which I'll pass over to my SW colleagues. Before we get started, just a couple of points on formalities. You will notice that you're all on mute for your benefit as well as the presenters. There is Q&A function in today's forum, which means you are able to ask questions by clicking the Q&A button, which is located on your Zoom menu. To the extent that your question is not answered throughout today's presentations, we have dedicated Q&A at the end of today's presentations. To keep things a little interactive, we'll run a couple of polls during the course of the presentations. And just in case they're not obvious when they do come on your screen, I'll point these out and provide instructions when they do appear. We'll wrap up just before 11 to allow you to get on with your day. So, before we get into today's presentations, let's go to some polls. And some of you might be interested in the one that we had last budget, which was back in March. And the question that we asked last time was, do you think, based on the budget, that the Morrison government will be successful at the upcoming election? 17% were true believers and said yes. 45% were on the money and said no. And a fair chunk of 38% were unsure. But overall, I'd say our audience got it right. We'll now move to the first of today's poll, which will hit your screens momentarily. Poll 1. So did the federal budget last night deliver for you? Yes, no, in part, unsure. Pretty simple. Click which box, which circle you think fits that bill, and then it will register. I'd like to introduce Greg Will to the discussion. Greg and his broader team joined SW in July of this year and are deeply entrenched in the Sydney SME market. Greg is going to provide some comments and insights in respect of our business sentiment survey. Greg, welcome to today's breakfast. Can you tell us a bit about the survey and what small business wanted?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. As most of the webinar participants would know, SW specialises in small business, and me, along with a number of my other partners, have been talking to a lot of you out there in small business land in the last 24 hours around what you saw in the budget or didn't see in the budget and how it would or would not impact you. On top of that, we wanted to see what the broader market said for those that aren't our clients, to just make sure that we're on the mark with some of the things that we're hearing. So we commissioned a survey in the last 3 or 4 weeks in order to just get that outside view. We had over 400 respondents, and largely those respondents, they range from businesses turning up to $100 million of turnover, but 80% of the respondents were in that bracket of 0 to 10 million, right in the sweet spot of what the ATO defines as small business. And we wanted to hear what you wanted from this budget. The big picture, as all of you would know, and what Catherine just mentioned coming out in some of her comments, staffing, labour, employees, that is the number one issue coming out of your responses to our survey. Almost 9 in 10, 85% are finding it difficult to find staff, attract staff, keep staff. 75%, three quarters of you out there are reliant on migrant labour. I'll talk a little bit about some of the minor things that have come out of the budget on that later on. But those that work in cafes, those that are in the construction sector, those that need help out in agribusiness, all those businesses are reliant on migrant labour to come into the country. And so it is heavily invested in terms of what's come out of the budget around help with migrant labour. Again, almost three quarters, 76%, 3 in 4 of the businesses out there have benefited from flexible working arrangements. So those businesses that are in the white collar industry or the administration industry, IT industries, obviously it is easy for them to be able to offer flexible work because you can work from home. But what about those businesses that need workers on the ground, retail workers on the shop front, construction workers on site? How do they offer flexible working arrangements? How do they benefit from flexible working arrangements? Or how do they attract staff where other employers are offering flexible working arrangements? And lastly, around the minimum wage. All small business employers want to pay a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. But almost 9 in 10, 85% of our respondents are telling us that the increases in the minimum wage will have an impact on their business. It's all great to make sure that workers are paid more, and we all endorse that, but we need small business to also make a profit in order to employ those people. We also looked at COVID. How are your businesses positioned pre-COVID and now post-COVID? So as you can see on the screen, 40% of the businesses we surveyed have come out off the back of COVID in a weaker position. And that, to some industries, is obvious. Those in the hospitality sector, those in the tourism sector, those that have their businesses largely in the CBD rather than out in the suburbs, we are seeing those businesses coming out of the pre-COVID and post-COVID regime in a lot weaker position than what they were before. But there are businesses that have strengthened coming off the back of COVID. Where there are services that were heavily prioritised during the COVID lockdowns, things like cleaning, things like maintenance, those businesses that specialise in those things have come off the back of those of COVID in a lot stronger way. 20%, 1 in 5. Has the budget actually delivered anything on the balance of staffing or pre and post COVID? If we move to the next slide, we then asked around what are the other big issues. So staffing, labour was the number one, but the other one was supply chain. Those businesses that are distributors, wholesalers, manufacturers, importers, almost 9 in 10, 85% are impacted heavily by supply chain challenges. I was just talking to a client last week that imports containers of his product out of Asia. Go back pre-COVID, that container would have cost about $1,000 to ship it from Asia into Australia. Now the cost of that container is anywhere between $6,000 and $10,000 a container. Not only is that putting pressure on margins, putting pressure on prices, and obviously the price of what their customers pay. But there's also still time delays. While those time delays have improved significantly over the last 6 months, we're still seeing extended time delays in getting shipments from overseas to come into Australia. Supply chain was one of the issues. Financial commitments was the other one. 1 in 3 businesses are saying that over the next quarter, so this is a very short-term time frame, over the next quarter, they will find it difficult to meet their financial commitments. What does that mean in terms of a business trying to meet its financial commitments and then how it can pay its own way? We also asked the question around the positivity or how would things change given the change in government over the last 6 months. And as you can see there, more than 50% of businesses said that they feel that they'd be better off under the new Labor government than what they were under the previous government. As we heard from Catherine, we are hearing out of the market that they are largely disappointed in terms of what's come out of the budget, and I'll talk a little bit about what has the budget delivered. It is more a business as usual than any changes that will support and or negate anything that they're doing. We have seen some changes around childcare, so indirectly, those childcare changes should offer more supply into the marketplace, more workers with primary and secondary carers putting their children into childcare because it is more affordable. How will that impact some of those issues coming out around the restraints on employees and restraints on labour? We have seen more resources devoted to skilled labour with more TAFE places. But what I'm hearing from small business out there, putting more resources into TAFE and skilled labour is great, but for workers or for students that go through those courses, that won't change anything in the short term. Those courses will take at least 12 or more months to deliver some of those structural changes for more workers that'll be there on the ground. We are seeing more resources being thrown into passport processing that will deliver a bit of a punch for our tourism and hospitality sector as people are able to travel more and be able to spend dollars in communities and economies. We have seen a very tokenistic extension or increase in help on the small business helpline. But again, small businesses don't actually want to need to call that helpline. They want to prosper and grow. And lastly, in terms of what Catherine mentioned about the migration program, there has been an increase from 160,000 places to 195,000 places in an increase in skilled migration. But largely those places have been devoted to people coming out of New Zealand rather than the broader economies around the world. So overall, what I'm hearing, not only coming out of the survey in terms of what small business wanted, but also what small business are telling me and my partners that specialise in small business, is that they wanted more out of this budget. They definitely wanted a helping hand, and they feel like it may not be there. In the positive news though, there isn't anything structurally that will impact them in a different way than what's currently happening, but they really did want more in order to support them as they go through these tough economic times. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Greg. I guess not surprising, labour and supply chain a big concern. I also couldn't help notice that one of the graphs that Catherine put up in her presentation was comparing Australia with the OECD, and we were actually worse than the OECD on labour underutilisation. So it'd be interesting to unpick that a bit more and maybe get Catherine's view a little later.
That'd be great.
So I'd like to now introduce and welcome Bill Lang to today's session. Bill is Executive Director of Small Business Australia, and the mission of Small Business Australia is to build a thriving small business sector that provides financial security for those working in small businesses and continues to support vibrant local communities for all Australians. So Bill, how did you find last night's budget, and how would you rate it in terms of building and supporting a thriving SME sector?
Thanks very much, Matt. Look, it's very disappointing, I think, for the majority of small business families. Something to remember about sort of the small business sector is, there's almost 2.5 million people that own and operate small businesses, with another 2.5 million people that work within them. And over and above the sort of economic security and financial security for those 5 million Australians is the role that those small businesses play as the hearts and souls of their local communities. Because after all, it's these businesses that are providing work experience for the high school kids, the part-time jobs, sponsoring the netball club, providing prizes for the school trivia night. So there's a critical role that small business families play in local communities all across Australia. And sadly, very much the tone, and most small business people are nodding their head up and down, okay, there's a new government, wears a different coloured T-shirt, everything's got to be much worse than what they've found, the guys that were in there must have been useless, et cetera, et cetera. But we never really see much talk pre the election, let alone now in this mini budget, about small business families and the small business community and the support they need. Now, the research that SW has conducted, we still have, 40 odd % that are worse off now financially and in terms of the strength of their business compared to the start of the pandemic. 1 in 3 quite concerned about meeting their obligations. Now, the good news is that small business families have been very well supported by their local customers. Their support of the buy local movement has been absolutely fantastic. And small business people, we don't expect the government to provide handouts to us, but we wouldn't mind a hand up every now and then, particularly as a result of the management of the pandemic where we see ourselves at the moment. Now, small business people are very optimistic. They look at the glass, as being half full. There'll be a whole bunch of opportunities, as a result of a steady as she goes type of budget with respect to, what the politicians are talking about. But there's never been a more important time for, everyone to support their local businesses and to encourage small business owners. And again, I'd like to thank SW and all the work that you and your team have done over the last couple of years with your many small business clients, as well as ANZ Bank. So again, we're not sort of really on the other side in many respects. We're now seeing lots of the possibly unintended consequences of keeping interest rates low by the Reserve Bank, by certain government policies of the last government in terms of cutting off migration and not supporting international students. And we're seeing that come through now in what the research is showing and what we hear day in and day out from many of our members. Access to performing staff. I'm going to use the word performing staff. I'm not going to use the word skills, because as all of us know in business, it's one thing to have people that are skilled, but of course they need to be motivated and they need to perform. So we're not seeing much with respect to how can we help businesses have people that can hit the ground running, or in those businesses be supported to be able to perform better. So the big buzzword is productivity. So I'll use small business language for that. More bang for the buck. And if we look at the amount of money that the federal government spends and where it spends it in terms of directly employing, bureaucratic public servants, all the way through to money going out for health services, NDIS, going out for health-related services around the country, there's no mention in the budget papers of any reform, any innovation to help the Australian taxpayers and therefore all the citizens get more bang for our buck. And I found it very interesting, Catherine's comments, just around I think the jargon was sort of structural spending that takes place within the budget for these services that we provide. But improving the productivity, getting another 5 or 6% of performance out of what we spend would go a long way to improving or reducing effectively the quality and quantity of what we get. And on the other hand, rather than them always looking at increasing taxes, like they didn't want to talk about it, but more taxes are coming. Now, for the 2.5 million small business families, many people don't realise this, but 60% use a legal structure, which is a sole trader or a partnership or a trust. And so the profit of the business is the income that small business family receives. So with respect to any plans on income taxes going forward, the income is ultimately coming out as, profit-related distributions. That is the income of many small business owners and small business families. So, we need to, hear more from the government, specifically around how are we going to have more people ready to perform? How are things going to be altered in a way so that there are true incentives to perform in your job? So, look, it's great that there's going to be an extra 30,000 people coming from a migration point of view, but what is the productivity of the immigration department? There are a number of private education businesses that have recently gone into administration because the international students couldn't get their visas processed in time to turn up. And those long-standing private education, family-owned businesses are in the hands of administrators and receivers. So, I wouldn't say, people like to say that COVID is over. Well, the implications of the way we've managed COVID are not over for 2 in 5 small business families. So not to see anything in the budget around how we're going to get more bang for our buck. What are the specific things? Small business, I think one of the explicit areas that I read early in the morning as I was going through what was released was more money for mental health services. Well, when you're, on the verge of losing, the family's accumulated assets, which are on the line when 60% of the structures are not in a company structure. The mental health line might be helpful, but without demand, without inputs from a staffing point of view, it's incredibly difficult to keep that business going. So it's disappointing, but again, we're very confident. We know how adaptive, the jargon word of the day is pivot, but how adaptive small business owners and families and private business owners have been over the last couple of years with what they've faced. Let's not respect this. Let's not forget the land of droughts and flooding rains and what we're seeing happen. I'm based here in Melbourne. We've had a bunch of businesses flooded in a couple of suburbs of Melbourne last night. These things are going to be ongoing. And when I look at the spending that's forecast in the budget, I don't think there's enough baked in with respect to stuff that's going to happen. I think the terminology, Catherine, that you use, shocks to the system. All these sorts of things are going to keep happening and keep going on. But we would have loved to seen what's the plan for getting more bang for our buck, and what's the plan for helping business owners access people that can perform. And I think the final thing really for all the private business operators, and particularly the clients of SW, the assumptions that are in the budget to some degree are, as I'm an ex-accountant, we would say a base case. So in terms of doing your forecasting, you can see what they're thinking about electricity. Yep, no, there's not going to be money getting sent back in savings to households. Mind you, the Ukraine war had started well before the federal election was held. So, of course, we'll hear the politicians talk about Ukraine and X, Y, and Z. But at the end of the day now, we have some assumptions that we can use because all of us would love more certainty. And we've had a pretty uncertain couple of years, but we can do some planning now and then wait probably for the real budget, which will be coming early next year. Thanks, Matt.
So, Phil, clearly a disappointing budget from a small business perspective. Were you expecting or more hoping for policies? And do you think the government is sympathetic to small business, or do you think they simply have their hands full on more macro issues?
Well, again, now when we sort of talk about macro issues and the ability of the Australian government to influence what's happening internationally, it's about ensuring that the structure of our micro economy, the structure of our industries are flexible, that they can adapt and they can change. A good example of an industry is, skills and training in vocational education. I can tell you, I don't think there's a private business owner sitting here listening today, and there's at least a couple of hundred of them that are going, yep, these free TAFE places sound like a fantastic idea. That 4-letter word starting with F, and when the governments use them. There is no evidence anywhere in the world in the education sector that free places leads to rapid development of knowledge and skills. So that's being thrown at a sector. There's not a TAFE in the country that generates a profit. They're all requiring additional funding from government and therefore taxpayers. So look, it's not surprising. And as all of us know, hope is not a strategy. We have to take what we know and then make adjustments and decisions in our businesses sort of based on what we know. And that's why those forecasts are important. But look, there's no surprise here. I was surprised that 50% of the respondents to the survey expected that things might be better for their businesses with a change of government. I know the survey question said Labor, but with a change of government. When we sort of look at what was the small business policy of what was then the opposition, there was no small business policy before the election. So if there is no policy, there's nothing to be managed, let alone measured. I saw the summary that Catherine put up around the core areas of what were in the budget. Notice there was no subheading there related to the 2.5 million small business families and the total of 5 million people that earn their living from the small business sector, and every Australian in every community that benefits from the contributions those families make to their local communities.
Thanks, Bill. We'll hopefully come back to you at the end with some further questions. And please, if you have questions for Catherine, for Bill or Greg, please use your Q&A function. So we're now going to turn to some industry and sector specific issues. And to help us dissect last night's budget, I'll call on a number of my SW colleagues from around the country. We'll keep this pretty punchy and simply draw out the headline issues for each of the industries. First up is Blaney Morgan, a partner in our energy and resource practice, to provide his thoughts on how the federal budget impacted stakeholders in the energy and resource sector. Blaney.
Thanks, Matt. The key focus areas in the budget were energy security, with lots of measures to improve energy over time, but not really in the short term, and especially with the infrastructure build for the energy transition. An example of that is the $20 billion of low-cost financing to modernise the electricity grid. There's also a number of other initiatives, including support for EV take-up, which is lowering of taxes, and also putting hydrogen and electric fuel stations around Australia, which is really building the infrastructure. But again, it's a long-term build, not a short-term change. And there's a number of initiatives in the National Reconstruction Fund for processing of raw materials in Australia, bringing a critical minerals R&D hub, and also a strategic mineral development program to assist critical minerals producers. And all of these are long-term programs that will build capability. There's also more money that's been funneled towards our energy regulators. And this has been directly taken from the previous government's initiatives to increase supply in new gas basins, rather than, so it really shows a change in philosophy between the two governments. There's also continued investment in skills and training for the energy transitions. And then, of course, there's thin cap changes to affect multinationals. This will be talked further in our tax section, but it does have a particular impact for energy and resources companies because the large projects require significant debt funding. Overall, there's good long-term programs, but it's wait and see on the shorter term areas. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Blaney. We're going to hear next from Chris Dexter, a partner in our Business Practice and Corporate Advisory Group, to talk through last night's announcements that impact the SME and the superannuation sectors. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Matt. So as both Greg and Bill have already really mentioned, there's not been a whole lot of changes announced in the budget, and that was probably really always to be expected. Certainly some changes around the periphery, but no meaningful tax reform, which is certainly unfortunate. But nevertheless, certainly a few points to go through and worth highlighting. So if we just go to the next slide, which has a bit of a recap on those points. The first one, similar to the last few budgets, further COVID-19 grants have been declared non-assessable, non-exempt income. So again, this is probably just a useful reminder, just to not assume that all COVID-19 grants you receive are in fact non-assessable, non-exempt. They do need to be specifically made non-assessable by the government. So the second point, also in relation to grants, is about $63 million over 3 years to help small and medium-sized businesses to invest in energy efficient equipment and upgrade that. So again, very light on detail at this point, so it remains to be seen exactly what the requirements will be in relation to that. The third point, also sort of a green type bent, was the previously announced aspects in relation to FBT exemption for battery, plug-in and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. So the requirements around that really are they need to be brand new, they need to be acquired after 1 July 2022, and they need to also be under the relevant cost cap, which currently sits at around $85,000. One thing to keep in mind here is while the benefits will be exempt, they will still be reportable on the employee's payment summaries or income statements. The fourth point is just one example of a broader theme in the budget, and might be a bit ominous as we sort of lead into the main budget in May next year. Additional funding for a variety of ATO-related compliance activity measures. This first one's a further $200 million a year for the next 4 years on the ATO task force. And so to give you some context, that's a $1.1 billion spend over the 5 years it's going to run for, and they're anticipating raising $2.8 billion off those activities. So then on the fifth point is actually in relation to a budget measure that was announced previously that is now not going to proceed. So this just revolved around self-assessment of effective life of intangible depreciating assets. And so then the next point in relation to director IDs. So this is a relatively new measure and probably a good reminder that for anyone that does need a director ID, the cutoff for applying for that is the end of next month. And so in the budget here, there's some further funding for the two bodies that are going to administer that program. So it does seem like they are very serious about this. And if you don't comply with the rules, the penalties are quite draconian. And so, yeah, money here to ensure that everyone does what they need to do under those provisions. And last but not least, in relation to the business side, so government's announced that they're going to legislate the tax treatment of digital currencies such as Bitcoin, just to enshrine what's already been their view. And that's that it's not going to be treated as foreign currency. It's going to be treated on capital account, income account, or on trading stock, effectively similar to how shares and other investments are. And then another previously announced budget measure that hadn't been enacted and will not proceed was in relation to, they proposed to limit the payments to businesses for goods and services to be no more than $10,000. So again, that measure has now been scrapped. On the superannuation side, very limited by way of any sort of changes. Just a couple of quick dot points here. So the first one's in relation to the downsizer provisions. So that relevant age to be eligible for that's now come down to 55 from 60, with the downsizer provisions being potentially quite a powerful tool for anyone to be able to put in $300,000 on concessional and outside of all the other relevant caps that you would otherwise incur or face with super, should you downsize and sell your house. And then last but not least is another previously announced budget measure that's no longer going ahead as well. This probably won't even be on many people's radars, but they had announced that for self-managed super funds with a good compliance history, they were only going to require them to get an audit every 3 years. So that measure's now been dumped. So all super funds will continue to need to get an annual audit. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Chris. Next, we'll turn to the education sector, and Steve Allen, a senior partner of our Melbourne Education Group, will take us through last night's budget. Over to you, Steve.
Yeah, I guess the key messaging from the budget for universities and schools is that the government is clearly waiting for international students to return back to Australia. They were generally funding universities and schools through the revenue they were getting mainly from the Chinese and the other Asian countries. And I guess until that settles down and they see how many international students are coming back, they're not going to give a lot of funding to schools and universities. So we expect to see more funding in future years for universities and schools, but there's not much in this budget. The emphasis of this budget was on skills shortages, regional Australia, and also funding the disadvantaged. So much of this budget funding is going to the TAFE sector and trades, new energy and aged care places. Some of the larger budget allocations are for universities. They get an extra 20,000 university funded places, mainly to assist disadvantaged students. From the regional perspective, Central Queensland University is getting $50 million for a campus in Cairns. And they're also investing in a startup year program with universities where students at universities who have good ideas will get some funding from the government to create a one-year business plan. And as Bill said, try and create some more small businesses. In the TAFE space, as Bill indicated, there's 480,000 fee-free TAFE places, with 180,000 kicking off from 1 January 2023, which is only a few months away. There's $50 million for TAFE to try and upgrade their technology in a technology fund. And again, in other areas of skill shortage with the environmental activities, there's another 10,000 new energy apprentices, where there'll be funding provided to people who take on apprentices in that particular area. In the schools area, very little funding. There's $20,000 per school for a student wellbeing boost, which isn't a lot of money when you average that across the student population. And they're still funding some COVID-related ventilation and air quality systems for another $270 odd million. And there's $60 million as there's a teacher shortage. COVID has created a lot of teachers to retire or leave the sector, so they're having to invest funds to try and get teachers back into the sector. So picking up on Bill's point that the money is really going to TAFE in this free TAFE area, very little for private providers. So it is sending a lot of private provider to the wall because most of the funding is going to TAFE. And essentially we're waiting for future budgets to see whether any money ends up back in schools and universities. Thanks a lot, man.
Thanks, Ted. So a sector that always seems to be in the budget headlines is the property and infrastructure sector. I'll hand over to Shayla Kedrick to provide some thoughts. Shayla.
Thanks, Matt. So there were two key takeaways affecting the property and infrastructure sector. One was continued transport infrastructure investment and two, housing affordability initiatives. The sector was looking for tax reform, but there were no new announcements on this. So we'll cover off on the other two. So in terms of the infrastructure investment, the government basically confirmed the $120 billion pipeline of investment in transport infrastructure. It's committed over the next 10 years, of which some 112 billion was a previous commitment. Some new projects have been added, other projects have been cancelled or deferred and redirected as part of the spending audit. And a significant proportion of the committed investments is allocated to beyond the forward estimates. So we have some new 8.1 billion over the next 10 years, starting from 2023, allocated specifically for priority rail and road projects. We have a pie chart there showing the split by state. But some notable projects that I noticed in there was the Suburban Rail Loop East in Victoria, 2.2 billion, and the Bruce Highway in Queensland, 866.4 million, and the $500 million corridor acquisition for the Sydney to Newcastle high-speed rail. That's an interesting one. Some notable cancelled projects or deferred projects, 5.4 billion Hells Gates Dam in Queensland, that's a big one. And a few seem to have dropped off the agenda, such as the East-West link. It's possibly in the $6.5 billion projects that have been deferred to beyond the forward estimates. That's it for infrastructure. We'll just move on to housing in our second slide, please. Thank you. So the focus was social and affordable housing. And some key initiatives under that were the investment of the $10 billion to establish a Housing Australia Future Fund. Now, it's the earnings from the fund that have been committed over 5 years to deliver 30,000 social and affordable homes. And another key point was 330 million over 5 years committed to deliver acute housing needs, of which we have 200 million dedicated to remote Indigenous communities, 100 million for crisis accommodation for women and children fleeing domestic violence, and 30 million for veteran housing. And the big topic of the budget in the property sector has been the Housing Accord, which is really a plan to plan. It's an aspirational budget measure with a key objective of increasing housing over 5 years. They're aiming for some 1 billion well-positioned new houses from 2024, but this accord is effectively a roundtable. It will aim to bring together state and local governments, leaders from the investment community, including some of the largest superannuation funds in Australia, some major banks, global asset managers, all to drive this initiative. So the Accord Project Group will meet for the first time in November to address various issues impacting the property sector, such as barriers to investment within the housing sector, improving revenue streams and investor confidence in the project pipeline, identifying partnership opportunities for government co-investment, and zoning and land supply issues. The government's role in this is really to facilitate institutional investment in affordable homes, but how the government intends to incentivise the private sector to lead the development and the affordable housing pipeline remains to be seen. The first lot of funding that they've committed is 350 million over 5 years, and it's designed to support funding to deliver 10,000 affordable homes, meaning funding is still required from other sources such as state and territory governments. So while the measure strikes the right tone and acknowledges that housing availability is a big problem, and that problem requires engagement of all key stakeholders in the property sector to contribute to the solution, it cannot be resolved in a government vacuum. However, as everyone's acknowledged, the devil's in the detail. And as Bill said earlier, I quite liked it, hope is not a strategy. So we have to wait to see how this unfolds into real policy. Just to highlight a couple of small things there, in other, FERB fees and penalties are set to double with different start dates, and the government's defunding the Australian Building and Construction Commission. So final thoughts, I guess as a new government, they've committed to tackle the critical issues, but have not really provided solutions just yet. I think by involving the key stakeholders to be part of the conversation about housing, it appears to be a good step in the right direction. So I'm hopeful. Thanks, Matt.
That was really insightful. The next industry we'd like to take a look at is the agribusiness sector. And to help us with that is Tom Malaki. Tom.
Good morning, Matt, and good morning, everybody on the call. Not a whole lot to report from an agribusiness perspective, but probably didn't expect a whole lot either. But in terms of some highlight, or high-level kind of announcement that were made, I think the biosecurity funding that was announced by the previous government that was to be spent over 4 years, that's going to be fast-tracked and spent over 2 years because of the current biosecurity threats, particularly around lumpy skin disease and foot and mouth that you might have been reading about in the newspapers. In connection with that, there has been funding set aside to develop a national livestock traceability system. So as you can imagine, typical of Australia, each state has their own system, doesn't necessarily talk to each other. And if you are facing heightened, biosecurity threats, then you need to be able to track and trace your livestock and fruits. And so obviously that's money well spent, in my opinion. In terms of some other announcements, you'll hear a lot about net zero, and I think there's been some announcements around powering the regional funds. So there could be some funds there that'll help, regional businesses. But in terms of specific to agri, there has been 8 million set aside to look at seaweed as a potential livestock feed solution, and that'll obviously help reduce methane gas emissions. So potentially that's an area in the next budget you might see more announcements in that vein. There's been more announcements around drought readiness and resilience. The government has kept some election promises for the forestry sector. There's about 200 million all up that'll be set aside to set up an institute of innovation and to provide some funding to operators to set up new plantations and the like. 300 million for sustainable agricultural practices. So specifics haven't been worked through yet, so not quite sure where that money be spent. So potentially keep an eye on that one. And then around connectivity, which is always a bugbear of the sector, there has been some funds set aside, and in terms of immediate opportunities, if you are adopting some new tech in the regions, well, then there's money being set aside, about 30 million for purchase and installation of that tech. So in terms of those are the opportunities. There are some other areas where spending has been cut. I know Shayla mentioned that the dam in Queensland, particularly around water infrastructure, some of those programs have been cut or deferred. Given we're last 3 years or so particularly wet. One of the the last budget we did set aside money to improve our dam infrastructure. Now for it to be taken away is a disappointment. Hasn't really been any help around the skills shortage specific to agri. The agricultural visa scheme has been scrapped, and there was a lot of consultation with the sector in that area. So that's probably a disappointing outcome. I know there's a South Pacific scheme which the government has announced, which assists with travel costs and the like. But if there's difficulties getting visa in the first place, it doesn't necessarily help. So overall, we'll look to the May budget to see what happens. But yeah, not too much to report from a positive perspective for agribusiness in this budget. So I'll hand back to you, Matt.
Thank you, Tom. So we've just closed the first poll results, and the question that we asked was, did the federal budget deliver for you? So 15% said yes, 28% no, 22% in part, and 34% are unsure, which I guess is fair enough until you work through what it actually means for you. So the final industry sector we'd like to look at today is childcare, including childcare operators. This is an increasingly complex area, and Jeremy Wick, one of our partners from our Brisbane office, will help us understand last night's announcements. Jeremy.
Terrific. Thanks, Matt, and thanks everybody for tuning in. Childcare, it's fair to say, was one of the winners out of last night, but not a spectacular winner as perhaps some people were expecting. Out of the budget last night, we know from the estimates that unemployment is tipped to edge up to 4.5%. So the initiatives around the childcare sector were aimed at increasing participation in the workforce. The chief announcement from last night was the change in the childcare subsidy, which will lift from 85% to 90% from July 2023 for families earning up to $80,000 per annum, shading down to a combined family income of $530,000. This is estimated to add an extra 37,000 full-time workers to the workforce at a cost of $4.6 billion. On top of this, the increase in paid parental leave to 26 weeks, shading in with it progressively for an additional 2 weeks up until 2026, will give access to greater flexibility for the sharing of the parental role between both parents, and it's designed, according to the government, to address the gender pay gap. On top of that, the government has acknowledged that childcare is an increasing burden on the budget, and a structural burden at that, and it has now announced an inquiry by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission into the rising costs of childcare. The inquiry costs $10.8 million, and it's also to be run in conjunction with a further review by the Productivity Commission. The sector-wide enterprise bargaining, flagged earlier on by the government, is also to be extended to the early childhood education workers. On top of that, to address the chronic skill shortage in the early childhood sector, the government has announced fee-free TAFE places in an attempt to address the worker shortage. There's an estimated 39,000 worker shortfall for the early childhood sector next year, so this is very welcome. In addition, the government has earmarked $33.7 million specifically to assist First Nations children to access a minimum of 36 hours per fortnight of subsidised early childhood education and care. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Another example of there being too few workers in the sector. So our final presentation today is Simon Tucker, one of our technical partners in our tax group. There were a grab bag of various tax announcements last night in the budget that don't really fit neatly into any one particular industry. So Simon is going to provide a brief overview of what we regard as the more important announcements. Simon, over to you.
Thanks, Matt. So some of these have already been discussed, so I don't intend to go through all of them. I suppose the most one of the larger proposed changes is something that came out as part of the Labor Party pre-election promise, and that was changes to the Australia's thin capitalisation rules. And for those of you out there who aren't familiar, the thin capitalisation rules want to limit interest deductions for foreign investors investing into Australia, and Australian entities investing globally. So the existing rules for ThinkUp operate on an asset-based safe harbour, as well as a few other measures. Now, the proposal is to move away from an asset-based safe harbour to an earnings-based measure, and so specifically an EBITDA measure, and so that's interest before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortisation, so proxy for profit. And so there'll be a limit of interest deductions or debt deductions at 30% of your profits. The measures do provide for an ability to carry forward any interest deductions that have been denied for 15 years. Mechanism for how those are being carried forward, where they're permitted to be deducted, is not being released, but further detail will be provided, I imagine, in the coming days and weeks. Within the ThinkUp rules, there are also other tests that will need to apply if you don't satisfy the safe harbours, and that's the worldwide gearing test. That'll be replaced with a similar measure, again based on profit rather than assets. And finally, the arm's length debt test, which is, I suppose, another measure to determine whether or not you can deduct all or only part of your interest, will be refined and will be applied in such a way that it can't be used to permit deductions for related party debt. In terms of intangibles, I think this has been spoken about already in terms of the ability to self-assess. That's being removed. The big thing here is for significant global entities, that's entities that have a turnover of greater than the group turnover, as in worldwide turnover, I should say, greater than 1 billion, where you've got payments for intangibles that are held in low or no tax jurisdictions, and those payments are being made to related parties, then there will be denial of deductions. And so a low or no tax jurisdictions has been classified in the budget papers to be a country with a headline rate of tax of less than 15%, or where there's specific patent box concessions that wouldn't tax the income. And so generally we'd expect this to apply to royalty and royalty-like payments. So this is a pretty big measure for SGEs that have structured their IP in low tax jurisdictions. We've also got some integrity rules that have been identified for off-market share buybacks. The idea here is to prevent public companies or public listed companies from streaming out franked dividends to shareholders. This similar measure was kind of announced prior to the budget, and I suppose this is perhaps the watered down version. If you could perhaps move to the next page. Thank you. So there will be additional tax transparency for significant global entities. There's already tax transparency in place for large entities. This will be an expansion of that. COVID grant, non-assessable income will be expanded. That's been discussed already. FBT exemptions for electric cars, although the rate is relatively low, so however it's indexed. So as it gets further indexed, it'll be more relevant, I suppose. And there's been a scrapping of a number of previously announced measures. Now, some of these have already been spoken about by the previous presenters, but as you have there's some changes to debt equity have been not going to go ahead. Asset-backed financing arrangements aren't going to go ahead. There's some miscellaneous TOFA amendments that were going to be legislated. They're no longer going to go ahead. And the collective investment regime for limited partnerships will no longer go ahead. We already have a regime for corporates, which commenced 1 July. The expectation was we'd have one for limited partnerships. It seems that won't be the case. I think that's all. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Simon. And there's actually a very good brief on the corporate collective investment vehicle on our website. So that brings us to the end of the formal presentations today. But before we get into our Q&A segment, we have time for one more poll, which should be hitting your screens as we speak. Okay, so how optimistic are you feeling about the next 6 months? You get one choice: very optimistic, slightly, cautiously optimistic, hopelessly pessimistic, or unsure. So you can tick a box there and then minimize your screens. So it's now time to ask the panel a couple of questions that have been asked both through the presentation and also coming in at the moment. So the government only subsidises on the first $121. As far as I know, nothing has been put in place to protect families from childcare centres increasing their gap fees. With this, do you think we're just throwing good money after bad?
The measures are clearly derived at increasing workforce participation, particularly among particularly women and also Indigenous families. It is correct that the government only subsidises up to roughly $121. It's actually based on an hourly rate cap that was increased on the 11th of July and it's indexed every year. But there is no price control on an operator from charging above that, and that's what creates the gap fees. The only thing that I would say that the sector has been the subject of increasing demands in respect of wages. As we all know, there's staff ratios that must be maintained for long day care operators. In addition, there's mandated requirements for early childhood educated, as in degree qualified teachers to be on staff. Now, there's a chronic shortage both in the education system and in the childcare sector of ECEC qualified staff, which means centre operators are in effect competing against school systems for those teachers. So the challenge really is around childcare operators being able to offer, meeting those requirements longer term and being able to offer a career path that keeps those people in the sector. So those sort of pressures add to the increase in the operator's daily rate. On top of that, I'd just like to say that all of us, or most of us, have sort of been through that, the pain of childcare fees. We know how much of a pain it is. The sector is actually extremely competitive, and that's, if you just look at the development approvals around childcare centres, new and against existing centres, it's an extremely competitive environment. So if one operator increases their fees, it's quite likely that there's other operators around, or that's in response to other operators doing the same. So it's cold comfort for when you find a centre that your child really loves and the people there that they really love. I get that. But really, in order to retain staff and compete against other operators, sometimes an increase in the daily rate is necessary. Is it throwing good money after bad? That's a question as to whether childcare fees should be subsidised at all, or whether government should pay for it 100%. Pick your answer there.
Thanks, Jeremy. This one here is probably for Shayla. So there's a few comments and questions around the fact that it's great to see some social housing on the agenda, but how real are the commitments?
At this stage, the commitments are more towards the social and affordable housing initiatives. So funding has genuinely been committed, like, for example, the $10 billion fund that will drive the earnings, which will be contributed towards 30,000 social and affordable homes, and the other 330 million over 5 years for acute housing needs. So those are committed projects and initiatives. The housing accord is the other big statement to come out of the budget, and I think that one is a bit more big and bold, but not really committed. It's really a plan to plan, and we have to wait and see how that transforms and translates into real policy. So I think there's definitely some committed investment towards social and affordable housing, but the housing initiative in general of additional housing towards the market is a wait and see.
Thanks, Shelley. Bill, perhaps one for you. There are various variations of this question, but what's number one on the small business wish list?
Number one on the small business wish list. Look, I think the first thing by way of context is, there's no average small business out of those 2.5 million. So depending on where you're located, what industry you're in, how long you've been in business, what your balance sheet position is like. Every small business is quite unique with respect to its situation. At the highest level, every small business operator wants more success with less stress. Based on, the survey that was conducted, people that will perform being available to the business is a major issue for particularly family businesses where there are family members working in it, where not only have they had the uncertainty and the stress of the last couple of years, but to keep going, the demands on the family members working in that business are higher than what they were pre-COVID.
And Greg, any thoughts or comments?
Yeah, I just add to what Bill said that I think all of us have experienced this. I was talking to a client last week, and they put an ad in the paper to find more staff. So to Bill's point, staffing, labour, as come out in our survey, is the major issue. But in terms of productive staff, the client said to me that they received 100 resumes for that role. But when they look through the CVs, nobody actually accurately was, applicable for that role in terms of the skill sets that were needed for that role. So there are people looking out there for roles, but there aren't the right people looking out that employers want. And so what the client said to me was that 2 years ago, they would have never looked at or shortlisted some of the candidates in those roles, but they're now looking at people that probably don't have the right skill sets just because there is such a labour shortage out there of good, qualified, and in Bill's words, productive people in order to fulfil the role. So it's not only boots on the ground, it's also the right people for the right roles.
Thanks, Greg. So the results of our last poll are just in. How optimistic are you feeling about the next 6 months? 1% are very optimistic, 13% slightly, a good healthy 61% are cautiously optimistic, 10% are hopelessly pessimistic, and 16% are unsure. So that brings us to the end of this morning's Federal Budget Forum. I'd like to sincerely thank Catherine Birch of the ANZ, Bill Lang of Small Business Australia, and Greg Will, and of course, all of our industry and technical experts for their insights. You can find Catherine's presentation, plus all of our key industry insights presented today on our website, sw-au.com.